Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a part of history that's often overlooked, but it's a big one: the Slavic slave trade. It's a tough subject, no doubt, but by exploring it, I think we can get a better grasp of this period and the impact it had.
Definitely. And we should be clear, the term Slavic slave trade doesn't quite capture it. It wasn't just Slavs, groups like the Finns were caught up in it too. And unlike the Atlantic slave trade, the driving force wasn't race, it was mostly religion.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't so much about ethnicity, but rather beliefs. That's a big difference from how we often think about the Atlantic slave trade.
Exactly right. One thing that really stands out, there aren't distinct ethnic groups that came directly from Slavic enslaved people, not in the places where they were taken at least. The focus was on religious others, you see. That really changes how the trade developed.
That's interesting. So before we jump into the specifics, can you give us a sense of how big this network actually was?
All right, imagine a web. It stretches all the way from Scandinavia down to North Africa, and from the middle of Europe to Central Asia. We're talking Vikings sailing down rivers like the Dnieper. Their boats would be packed with captives, headed for markets as far away as Al-Andalus and Iberia, or even the bustling cities of the Abbasid Caliphate.
That's incredible. I mean, that's a huge network. How did they manage all of that? All those distances in different cultures?
Well, to understand that, we need to go back in time a bit, back to the 7th century, a time of big changes in Europe. Slavic people were migrating south, coming into contact with powers like the Byzantine Empire, and they were creating new kingdoms amidst all these ongoing conflicts.
Sounds like a recipe for, well, exploitation.
Yes, indeed. And in this setting, we start to see the early signs of the trade. Islamic sources, some from as early as the 8th century, mention the sakalaba. That was the term used for enslaved Slavic people. It shows there was already a system in place.
Wow, so this wasn't just some sudden event. It seems like this started during this time of migration and conflict. But what made the Slavs, and those grouped with them, such a target?
It all comes down to religion, really. Both Christian and Muslim powers believed they could enslave pagans. They thought it was acceptable, even morally right.
It's a bit chilling, isn't it? Seeing how religious differences were used to justify such actions. Was there anyone who disagreed? Anyone who opposed this practice?
Sadly, opposition was pretty limited, especially at the beginning. Even within Christianity itself, there were divisions. For example, followers of the Bosnian Church, they didn't align with Catholicism or Orthodoxy, and sometimes other Christian powers would enslave them.
So even being Christian didn't guarantee protection. It seems differences in beliefs, even within the same faith, could be exploited. This trade must have gone on for a long time. Were there any major societal changes that impacted it?
You're right, it did last a long time. While feudalism eventually reduced the need for slaves in Western Europe, the demand in Eastern Europe and the Islamic world continued. Just imagine major routes running through Prague, along the Danube and the Volga River. All these people captured in conflicts and raids were funneled into these bustling slave markets.
So different places had different needs, but the trade just kept going.
Exactly. And those regional differences played a role in what types of work enslaved people did. Some were destined for domestic labor, especially in Byzantium, while others, particularly those sent to the Islamic world, faced a much harsher reality. We'll get into the specifics a little later.
All right, so we've set the scene. We see this web of religion and power dynamics. Now let's shift our focus to the people themselves. How did people actually become enslaved? Where were they taken from?
Well, the most common way, unfortunately, was through warfare. Conflicts would inevitably lead to captives, and those captives would be sold as slaves. It created this terrible cycle fueled by both economic and political reasons.
It's like warfare itself was creating the demand for more slaves. And then those slaves were used in more conflicts. Were these always large-scale battles? Or were there more targeted operations as well?
Both played a part. There are accounts of targeted raids, both by Islamic and Christian states. Particularly in areas like Bosnia and Ukraine, entire communities lived in constant fear of these attacks.
That's terrifying. It's hard to imagine living with that kind of fear. Now, when we think about this era, the Vikings always come to mind. Were they involved in this trade as well?
Oh, absolutely. Picture those iconic Viking longboats sailing down the Dnieper and Don rivers. They weren't just trading, they were also on slaving expeditions. What's interesting is these raids continued even after many Slavic kingdoms converted to Christianity. Powers like the Crimean Khanate kept the demand for slaves high. It seems converting to Christianity didn't necessarily offer protection from enslavement.
That's surprising. So even as some Slavic populations adopted Christianity, the threat of being enslaved remained. Were there other ways people ended up in this system besides these raids and conquests? I mean,
Yes, debt slavery was a factor, especially in places like Byzantium. It was a last resort for those struggling to survive, and it often pushed them further into vulnerability and exploitation, far from home with very few options.
So even without outright war, economic hardship could lead to enslavement. Were there any factors within Slavic societies themselves that contributed to the trade?
That's an important point. Internal conflicts among Slavic groups play a role as well. These conflicts were often driven by power struggles or competition for resources. It wasn't just external forces preying on them. Their own internal dynamics contributed to the problem.
That adds another layer of complexity. So we have this multifaceted system with people being drawn in from different directions: warfare, raids, debt, even their own internal conflicts.
Mhm.
Now let's follow the journey of those who were captured. How did they go from those desperate circumstances to those markets you mentioned earlier?
Imagine this network of rivers and roads, crisscrossing all over Europe and beyond. It was like the circulatory system of this whole trade. The Volga River, the Black Sea, the Adriatic, the Danube, all these major channels moving people incredible
It's
distances.
hard to grasp the scale of it all. This web of routes spanning continents. Who were the main players controlling all of this?
Groups like the Volga Bulgars, they were positioned at key points along these waterways, and they made a lot of money off the movement of people. They weren't just bystanders, they were actively shaping how this human traffic flowed.
So they were more than just middlemen. You mentioned Prague and Kiev earlier. What made them such important hubs?
Think of them as centers of commerce, magnets for anyone looking to buy enslaved people. Many Slavic states were smaller or not very organized, so these larger cities became the main collection points, drawing people in from all across Eastern Europe.
So people captured or forced into this system, they would end up in these major centers. And then where were they going?
The Islamic world had a much bigger demand for slaves than Byzantium. Byzantium mostly needed specialized labor, but the Islamic world needed both skilled and unskilled workers. It created a much larger market. So many captives were transported to places like Al-Andalus or even further.
That difference in demand must have had a big impact on their experiences. What were the journeys themselves like? I mean, what kind of conditions did they face on these long trips?
I imagine being forced to march for miles and miles, often on foot, with barely any food or water, living in constant fear. Disease was rampant, exhaustion, abuse. It was all too common. In some places, like Armenia, male captives were even castrated, a horrific procedure with a high mortality rate, all for the sake of profit.
It's heartbreaking. To think of the suffering they endured, treated like objects. What happened to them once they reached these markets? What were their lives like after they were sold?
Well, it varied a lot. It depended on where they ended up, their skills, even just luck. In Byzantium, domestic labor was common, serving in wealthy households or working in workshops. But in the Islamic world, the roles were much more diverse, with both opportunities and dangers that went far beyond what was seen in Byzantium.
So their fate was tied to where they landed in this complex system. What can you tell us about the specific differences in their experiences?
For women, the Islamic world presented a unique set of dangers. While domestic work was common in both regions, the Islamic world also used enslaved women in harems. It's a reality that's often hidden by Orientalist fantasies and romanticized depictions. We have to remember that for these women. It was dehumanizing and often violent. Nothing like the exoticized images we often see.
It's a good point. Sometimes the stories we tell can obscure the brutality of what really happened, especially for women. Where were most of these women taken?
Major cities like Baghdad and Granada, flourishing centers of trade and culture. Harems played a big part in their social structures, though it was often hidden. It's hard to fathom how many women were taken from their homes, transported across continents, and forced into servitude and sexual exploitation, all within these very cities.
It's a chilling thought. And what about the men? What kinds of roles were they forced into?
Sadly, the stereotypes about Slavic people being barbarous had a big impact. This perception, based on prejudice and ignorance, led to many men being forced to become soldiers. They were seen as expendable tools of war.
So instead of respecting their strength and ferocity, they were exploited for it.
Exactly. They were trained to fight, often guarding harems or serving powerful masters. It was a harsh existence, full of danger, with very little freedom. A stark contrast to those who ended up in domestic service or skilled trades.
A grim reality. Was there any chance of escape, any possibility of a better life, or even freedom?
While escape was always a dream, the reality for most was a life of hardship and confinement. However, the political landscape of Al-Andalus offered some unique opportunities. It was divided into these small kingdoms called taifas, and they were constantly fighting for power. So skilled soldiers, even those who started as slaves, could sometimes rise through the ranks, proving their worth in this chaotic environment.
So in the midst of all this political turmoil, some individuals manage to create a different path for themselves.
Yes, it's important to acknowledge those glimmers of hope, those moments of individual agency. It reminds us that even within oppressive systems, human resilience and ambition can find ways to thrive. But we can't forget that these were exceptions, not the rule. For the vast majority, life was a constant struggle for survival, with freedom a distant dream.
It's a reminder that even within these broad historical narratives, there are countless individual stories waiting to be discovered. We've explored the routes, the markets, the different roles people were forced into, but I'm curious about the lasting impact of all of this. How did this trade shape societies, both for the enslavers and the enslaved?
That's where things get really complex, both historically and morally. Understanding the experiences of those who were enslaved is a challenge. Historical records often focus on the powerful, leaving the stories of the oppressed largely untold.
It's tragic that their voices, their experiences are so often lost to time.
It is. We get glimpses, of course. The successful soldier who overcame his origins, a woman in a harem who gained influence. But these are exceptions, just fragments of a much larger and mostly silent story.
A tragic silence indeed. But even without those direct accounts, surely we can still see the impact of this trade, how it affected how people viewed themselves and others.
Absolutely. The Slavic slave trade contributed to the development of prejudice against Slavs, often tied to their pagan origins. And this prejudice persisted even after many converted to Christianity. The stereotype of barbarity used to justify their enslavement. It cast a long shadow, influencing how Slavic people were perceived and treated for centuries.
A dark legacy for sure. But in the midst of all this darkness, were there any moments that showed a recognition of the human cost, any attempts to challenge or at least lessen the impact of this exploitation?
Yeah, there are a few that come to mind. One example is a treaty signed between Byzantium and the Rus back in 911 CE. It included a provision for releasing enslaved people, those who had been captured by other groups, that is. It suggests that they recognized, at least diplomatically, that slavery had consequences beyond just the immediate economic impact.
So even those who participated in the trade, they could still see the injustice of it, in some cases at least.
Right. It doesn't erase all the suffering, of course, but it shows how complex the moral landscape was back then. Even within a system built on exploitation, there were people who struggled with the human cost.
It's interesting to see that history isn't always black and white. Even in systems of oppression, there are always individuals and ideas pushing against the norm. As we wrap up our deep dive into this often forgotten part of history, what are the key things you hope our listeners take away from this?
I think the biggest one is just the sheer scale and complexity of the Slavic slave trade. It spanned continents, lasted for centuries, and its impact on societies is still being felt today. It reminds us that events that seem distant can have lasting consequences, shaping cultures and social structures in profound ways.
It makes you realize that history is interconnected, how events in one part of the world can echo through time and space.
Exactly. And secondly, I hope our listeners come away with a better understanding of the diverse experiences of those who were enslaved. From domestic workers in Byzantium to soldiers in Al-Andalus to women forced into harems. Their stories, even though they're often fragmented and hidden, offer a glimpse into the human cost of this trade.
It's a stark reminder that behind the historical facts and figures, there are real people with their own stories of resilience, suffering, and sometimes extraordinary courage.
Absolutely. And that brings me to my final point, the importance of recognizing the silences in the historical record. The voices of those who endured the worst of this trade are often the ones we hear the least. Their experiences lost to time or buried under dominant narratives. It's our responsibility to acknowledge those silences, to search for those missing perspectives, and to honor their stories, even when the details are scarce.
It's a good reminder that engaging with history isn't just about learning facts. It's about actively searching for a more complete and nuanced understanding of the past.
And perhaps most importantly, connecting this historical understanding to the fight against modern-day slavery and human trafficking. While the forms may have changed, the systems of exploitation and dehumanization still exist. By learning from the past, we can hopefully equip ourselves to challenge these injustices in the present.
It's a call to action, a reminder that history isn't just something we learn about. It's a tool we can use to create a more just and equitable future.
Indeed. The echoes of the past are still present today. And by amplifying the voices of those who were silenced, by acknowledging the complexities and lasting effects of these injustices, we can hopefully contribute to a world where such exploitation is a thing of the past, not a continuing problem in our present.
Thank you for joining us on this journey, for being willing to delve into this difficult but important chapter of human history. We hope it sparked your curiosity to learn more, to seek out those missing voices, and to join the ongoing fight for justice and human dignity.